Hello, everybody. This is Paul Talbot with 9.connects, and glad that you're here today. You're in the right place if you are here for our overview of the Altium Constraint Manager. So we've got a lot to cover today, so let's get on with it. Some quick housekeeping notes. Number one, feel free to use the panel to ask questions. I do have a couple of other people behind the scenes over here who may be able to assist you in trying to get those questions answered as quickly as possible. If they cannot answer them, then I should have enough time today to go through those after the primary demonstration here. And secondly, well, as I mentioned, we'll stay on for some questions. You do have a questions panel with your GoToMeeting set up over there, so that's what you'll use to write those in, and we can look at those in real time. All right, with that being said, we have two polling questions for you. Let's have a little bit of fun first. So we'll bring up the first polling question. So if you don't mind, take a look at that one very briefly here and get your humble opinion about it. All right, there you go. All right, so 38% of you said it was Cookie Monster, of course, though the green kind of gives it that Oscar the Grouch type of look. That was the argument there on that one. For those who are like 20%, you probably didn't probably grew up more as a millennial or Gen Z or so. I totally get that. But for you 14%, I agree. We'll just get on with it. So I do have actually a more important question to ask you guys. Have you used a constraint manager before, at least either one Altium or like one from Allegro or OrCAD? So if you take a moment to just respond to that, do click all that apply. Okay, so we'll close this. And again, you can take a look at the numbers over here. They're actually very interesting. I would have actually figured that a lot of people have not touched the Constraint Manager. So it's, but it almost looks like if you exclude the D, because obviously there's multiple choices to be made here, it's almost about 1/3 across the board in terms of whether you've used it, poked around, or have not used it at all. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone in this presentation here today. And so let's get on with it here. Thank you for answering the polling question. So what are my objectives? Number one, discuss the fundamental difference between the classic design rules and the Constraint Manager. I'm pretty sure that everybody who's attending this right now is very familiar with the design rules and knows their way around it. So as we're going along, I'll show these differences as to what you're going to see between the design rules and the Constraint Manager. We will definitely talk about the caveats to using the Constraint Manager. You'll see some benefits to it, but you'll also see a little gotchas along the way that you really ought to be aware of if you're going to do this. And then lastly, we'll certainly spend some time demonstrating the Constraint Manager, try to capture all the little bits and pieces that make the Constraint Manager kind of come together, okay? All right, so what is a Constraint Manager? If you haven't had an opportunity to really look at it yet, this is basically a picture of it. Now, I did take this picture in the what they call the light gray backgrounds of Altium Designer just because it shows a little bit better over here. I am going to run the demonstration in the black, white, or the dark gray version of Altium, but just wanted so everybody could see this here. So what is it? It basically is pretty much an editor. And in this editor, you have 3 different buttons. You'll have a 4th one if you're on the PCB side. This one's for the schematic side. But what you're seeing over here is you list all the primitives. And then what you see on each one of the columns are the rules. So it is a table-based, primitive-driven rule manager. Now, right now, in its current form, it's strictly for the nets. It's not for components just yet. They're working on that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here on a later slide. But that's the idea behind it. You have your primitives listed. Your second column is your constraint sets, which we'll talk about. So this basically is the idea of creating a series of different rules, and then you bundle them up as a constraint set, and then you can apply those to other nets or other net classes. Okay, and then you have your individual rules down here. And by the way, it's not just a single value. You'll see that when we go into the Constraint Manager, anytime you bring or click on one of these cells over here, there is something down below that gives you more detail as to about the information that you're putting in for that particular cell. That's the idea behind it. It's basically a table. Okay, so what are the benefits of it? Quicker access to the rules, an easier way of reading rules, especially on the schematic side, right? Because currently what do we do on the schematic side? It's always about a bunch of directives. And when we do the directives, we've got to click into the directive first. And then if we want to see the rule, we got to click in within the properties of that directive. You've got to go double click into the rule itself and then take a look at it. Those are dialogues, so it locks you out of the schematic editor. This Constraint Manager is it's kind of its own separate editor, and I'll explain that a little bit more here in a few minutes, but you can at least go back and forth between that and the schematic editor rather quickly. Okay, you can define net, differential, X-class nets in the schematic without directives. I'll demonstrate that here today. And a smoother transition for the Allegro or CAD users. So you got to always remember that, Altium is a business, right? And of course, they are always trying to keep their customers happy, but they're also trying to bring in new customers in a very saturated market. They know that the Constraint Manager is a big sell and a big win for Allegro Cadence users, and so they want to get up to speed with the same type of capability. So that's really their aim here, is to see if they can win over a few more of the Allegro or CAD folks. Okay. What are the caveats of the Constraint Manager? Now, there's a number of what I'll call rough edges, and I'll show those in the demonstration. A rough edge means that there's something that Altium can improve upon, but it's not a showstopper. But these caveats are kind of a little bit, hey, before you jump into it, you ought to know. So number one, you have to have the following. You have to have a professional Altium license, and you have to have A365 Pro. Now, what I mean by the professional license, because I got burned on this when I started digging into this, we had a regular Altium license. There's really no difference between a professional one and an Altium license. They put the word professional in front of it after Altium Designer 22, but they're effectively the same thing as any other full-up Altium license. But apparently the Constraint Manager is looking for that word. So if you have a license, let's say that you had back from Altium 20 and you keep bringing it forward because you're paying the maintenance on it, and you cannot get access to the Constraint Manager, contact your rep. Their rep should be able to quickly and without charge change that license from Altium to professional, because they're the exact same license. So just be aware of that. Okay, secondly, new projects only. So old projects will continue to use the classic design rules. So if you're opening up Altium 24 and you're bringing in a project you did 2 years ago, it's still going to use the design rules. And by the way, when you do a new project, and I'll show this here in a few minutes, you have the option of using the Constraint Manager or continuing to use the classic design rule set. Okay. You cannot, now I'm going to say with this, within a project, you cannot change between the Constraint Manager and the design rules. So if you're already up and running and you've started this project and you're like, this Constraint Manager thing's not really working for me, within that project, you really cannot change between the two. However, there's some ways of doing it so that you can, like if you have an older version of Altium, then you can open that up and bring it in, because Altium's going to it will be able to still read what you've done. So the sooner you decide to go back to the design rules, the better it is to kind of fix those things. So I did experiment with this a little bit just to see the backwards compatibility type of thing. And so if you do bring something back from, let's say, 24 into 22, you will get this message over here. It says, it's using the Constraint Manager. Any of the constraints that you have set up are going to be lost. However, the rules themselves are not going to get lost. So it will look something like this. Bring this in over here. Okay, so what I did, and you'll see this project example that I did here a couple minutes ago. So it does bring everything in, just that it's not going to be in a very, it's going to be a little bit messy, and you'll probably have to do a lot of cleanup, but it does capture the rules. So you don't lose anything. It's just gonna not be very efficient in the way that it's showing all the scopes. So let's talk about the roadmap for a moment. So this roadmap came from Altium's presentation back in December of 2023 when they were first introducing the Constraint Manager. So here's what you already have in 2024. As I mentioned, spreadsheet like editor, constraints, inputs from Schematic, which is this big benefit, one of the major benefits to it. Redefinable constraints, you can change these things pretty much on within the Constraint Manager rather easily. I'll show that as we go along in demonstration. Class-to-class matrix, clearance matrix. So you can not only set up some clearances for your own individual, let's say nets or net classes, but you can also you can also set them up based on different classes. So if you say I've got class A versus class B, then these are the clearance rules that I want to apply to it, okay? There are what they call electrical and physical constraints. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. So what is it missing? What are they going to do going forward? So right now, there is no way of doing any type of components constraints. Everything you'll see is based off the nets. So in 25, they'll allow you to actually apply things to the components. X signal editor with T branches, and I have played with this. Right now, you can do X signals, but they have to be basically kind of a point-to-point thing with a resistor in the middle or a capacitor in the middle of it. If you start getting into T branches, it just does not know what to do with it. at this time. Also DFM and DFA constraints. So if you're familiar with the design rule set, there are different sets of rules for assembly and for manufacturing. And right now, and by the way, you can still get to them, but they're not in the table format. Okay, so there's kind of this advanced tab that they have in the Constraint Manager on the PCB side, which was kind of a convenient way of making sure that you still had access to all the rules, but they're not in a spreadsheet-like fashion. And so we'll take a look at that here again in a few minutes. Constraints for providing, constraints provided by assembly manufacturing. So those type of things will be added in there as well. Constraint reuse in A365. So right now, even though it requires you to have A365 Pro, there's no mechanism to create it into a template to bring it in for a new project. In fact, I don't know of any way of exporting it out from a project to use in another project at this time. So hopefully they'll remedy that here pretty soon. And then live violations and table. Right now, the table is one of those things like the design rules. You go in, you set it up, you close it, and then you rely on your, let's say, your PCB layout or your message panel or the HTML that comes up if you do a batch DRC. So right now, there's no live violations on the PCB side of the Constraint Manager. When we get into 2026, this is where they're going to really start trying to make it look like OrCAD Allegro. So for example, formula-driven rules, I have a slide, I'll explain what that is in just a moment. They'll also add in your DFT constraints and some analysis stuff if you are using these additional tools like the power integrity, signal integrity, and all the like. And the last one, which I'm actually kind of very excited about, is the constraint inheritance, so library modules, those type of things. So let me give you kind of an example where I think this would be really useful. If I create a component, let's say a connector, and I know for a fact I've got to have at least an inch clearance around it because I got to get fingers in there, to pull the, to have the connector be able to pull in and out. Then instead of having to deal with that on the project side, I can immediately add that in as a part of the footprint. So the footprint automatically introduces that rule upon placement, which I think would be really useful. So that's the roadmap in general. So going back to the formula-driven rule, I wanted to kind of give an example of this. So imagine you had a rule, let's say it was a length rule. And so you had a bunch of nets in this one class that said the length has to be between 300 and 600. So anything less than 300, more than 600 would be a violation of this particular rule. Class B has its rules between 500 and 700. Say, okay, well, let's say I have one that's 500 and one that's 600. I can have yet another rule that says, okay, look, you've passed Class A and Class B's requirements, but I have another rule that says you have to still keep the length less than 1,000, and at that point, that would be a violation. So that's the idea of a formula-driven rule, at least a very simple one. So with that, let's get on to Altium Designer, and let's take a look at the Constraint Manager. So let's click here and escape out of that one. Let's put that to the side for the moment. So here's Altium. Let's make this a full screen so you guys can see it a little bit better. Let's do a view document. Okay. What I've done over here is that this is just something for me to copy because I want to show you what happens when you start a project. And then from there, we'll build off of that. So I'm going to use this as kind of a copy and paste just so that we have to spend time building up something. So let's take it from the beginning. If I've got Altium, and this is 24.4.1, which I believe is the latest and greatest, and they've added a couple of features in that I will show because of this recent release. But let's say I'm using this and now I want to start a new project. So I'm going to go into File, I'm going to New, and we'll do our project. And let's take a look at what we get when you see the project dialog. Okay, so the first thing you're going to notice is that we have this new thing called the Constraint Manager. And by default, it will turn on. So Altium wants you guys to obviously use it. So that's what they've done over here. So if you don't want to use it, you can turn it off. The other thing I find kind of interesting, and again, even though you have to have that more recent license and you've got to have the A365 Pro in order to do this, you can do this as a local project. And you can also do it as a version control project as well. So the Constraint Manager is always available to you regardless of where you're going to park this project. So for our purposes here, I am going to park this locally, and I'm just going to give this a very brief name over here so I can find it afterwards. Okay, so we've got that in there, and it's going to place it accordingly. And I am going to leave the Constraint Manager on, otherwise this is going to be a very short demo. So let's let it create the project. So there's nothing whiz bang that comes out immediately. There's no, dialogues that come up or anything that's different that you would not that would be unexpected. So here I am going to add in a schematic and a PCB. So let's add those in there. And I do guys just run with me on this, but since it is a new project, and I know you probably know this very well, so I'm going to add new to project a schematic, and once that Altium contemplates that, we'll put this PCB in there. And while it's thinking there, once that's done, we will save this off. And one more to go. Thanks for your patience, folks. Appreciate that. Okay, so now that we have our project set up, let's take a look at the schematic side. So if you are going to use the Constraint Manager or it's been enabled, then go into Design, and at the very bottom here, you will see the Constraint Manager. So let's just turn this on for just a moment. So a couple of notes to be made here, because right now we have an empty project, right? So you're not going to see a whole lot of what's going on here if I click between them. But what I do want to mention here is that this actually is an editor. So it's not a dialog, because as I mentioned earlier, if you have a dialog, it locks you out of the editor. And it's not a panel, because panels tend to be dynamic in the sense that if you make a change in the panel, it is instantaneous. This over here, if you make changes to this, you have to save it. And all too many times when I did the practice runs for this, I would forget to save it, okay? Or if there was a change over there, I didn't refresh it, and as a result, like, why am I not seeing what came from the schematic sheet, okay? So those are the little things you just gotta remember. You are actually working in an editor when you've got this up. Now, this editor is not universal. This is strictly for the schematic side. So now how do I know it's for the schematic side? For two reasons. Number one, it'll say constraint and it's PRJ PCB. And secondly, there's no fourth button. Now let me go over to the new PCB doc that we created, and let's look at that Constraint Manager for a moment. So if we go into Design and we go into the Constraint Manager, you will see that we actually have 4 buttons here. So here's the catch-all that I talked about earlier on. Okay, so the catch-all, and you may have seen this. Okay, so in the design rules, you may have noticed something called a document view. This is the exact same thing. And my theory on this is that Altium kind of recognizes the fact that there has to be some relationship between the Constraint Manager and the design rules, since people are still going to be using the design rules. So I think they can't just completely divorce the Constraint Manager from the classic design rule set. So this kind of acts as, I would say, kind of the intermediary between them. So it allows, for example, this project to be put in an older version of Altium, okay? And there's another major feature for this. As I mentioned earlier on, when we start looking at what the rules they've set up over here for the physical and the electrical, not all of them are listed, right? So they are going to get to that eventually in 25 and 26 in those versions, but right now they don't have all the rules set up. So if you need a rule that's not in the physical, the electrical, and or you still got to do a query, then you still have the ability to do a query. So if I go over here and I say add custom rule, here I can now do my queries. So that's the whole idea behind that over here, right? I am going to close this without saving it for the moment, so I will not, before I do anything else, just as again, a quick reminder, what you're looking at over here is the one on the PCB doc. This one over here is the one for the schematic documents. So they are 2 different editors. The other thing I'll mention, I'll show you this in a little bit, is that there's no dynamic information that goes between the 2. If I do something on the PCB side and want to go to the schematic side, I have to ECO it. Same thing for the schematic side. If I do whatever on the schematic side, I've got to ECO it back to the PCB side. So it's not a dynamic thing, okay? So just be aware of that. So I'm going to close this one here and say don't save. All right, let's go back to our, so let's go back over here for a moment and to this constraint for just a moment here. So as I mentioned, there are 3 buttons. So you have what they call the clearance button, and they have this what they call clearance matrices over here. And this is where you can actually set up matrices between, like, let's say a class A and class B. So if you want to set up very specific clearances between certain classes, maybe like between a power class and everything else, or a power class and another power class, you can set that up over here. And then under the physical, in a moment, you'll see all of these listed here. And again, as what you see over here is the different rules that you have available to you here. So you can see that there are some default rules that are already set up. And I'll go through the motions of this. It works a little bit better when you actually have a net list to work with. And then also on the electrical side as well, it has its sets of rules as well. So let's put something that we can play with here into here so we can demonstrate some of the features. So I am going to copy this so that we don't have to do a whole lot of design here because our time's limited. So I'm going to do a Control C and dump this into my new demo here. And you can see that I've kind of set up things accordingly because there are certain things that you may have already done, and there's other things you can do within the within the Constraint Manager itself. So one last thing I've got to do here is I do have to give these a proper designator. So I'm going to do a tools annotation, annotate schematics quietly, and I'm going to say yes. And I will save that, and now we're good to go. So now as a result of that, if I go into my constraints, okay, you'll notice that nothing seems to have changed. Why is that? Because again, it's not dynamic. In order for me to do this, I got to hit the refresh, and now it brings in a bunch of stuff. So it's brought in all of my nets here, and it's brought that net list not only here, but also on the electrical side as well. And even here on the clearances, okay, it didn't do anything on this one. Sometimes it picks up on the classes that we've created here. But let's go over here to the physical side. So what did it create? Okay, so here you'll see a couple of bars here. So and then I was expecting it to create group A here. Let me check something here very quickly. Or at least class B and class C. Oh, I know why I didn't do it. Let's talk about that. Let's go here. Okay. I've jumped the gun a little bit over here. Let me talk about these here first. So interestingly enough, Altium recognized the fact that I had already created with rules in the directives. Okay, so if we go back over here to Group A, you'll see over here in Group A, I have actually created 2 rules. And I kept the names different because I want to see if Altium was triggering off of those, but it recognized that both of these, if we look here on the right side, this has a width constraint, and I gave it an odd number so I could differentiate it from the other rules here. So this one and this one over here. So it did recognize it. It didn't pull them in, but it recognized it. So if we go back over here, you'll see that there are these bars. Now the reason there's these bars is because right now what I've got in the Constraint Manager and what I've got in the basically in the directives are different. So that's why you have these. Now, if the constraint manager and the directives are the same, these would be green bars, okay? So it's a question of whether or not you want to change these to match the directive or if you want to ultimately remove the directive from the schematic. So one thing the configuration manager is not going to do is remove any of your directives. It will be in conflict with them, and ultimately the constraint manager will win, but it's not going to try to go and erase anything off your schematics. So just be aware of that. So secondly, if we want to pull in information from the directives, you can see Altium didn't automatically do it, except for the fact it gave us a warning over here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on here, and you'll see we'll go through a lot of these here in the next couple of minutes. But the one I'm going to do is say import from directives. So I'm going to click on that. And now you can see that we have everything that I had already put a directive on has come in. So for example, the differential pair, I put the directive to the differential pair for 2 of the lines. You can see that up here. There's another one down here that I did not put those directives on, so that's why these are still considered to be regular nets. I also put directives on for Group B and Group C. So let's take a look at those for a minute to see what those look like. So on this side over here, you can see that I did put in the differential pairs here, so that's why it picked up on it. This one it did not, but I will show how to do that within the Constraint Manager. You can also see I was kind of playing with this a little bit between using the blanket and the individual lines, and these worked out just fine. So we do have a class Group B and a class C class set up within the Constraint Manager, okay? Now the one thing that I tend to forget to do, and you want to keep on remembering to do this, save early, save often, okay? So I'm going to press save here to make sure this does get saved. So now we've got this list over here. Now, before we start getting into rules, let's do a few other things. So for like the diff pairs, let's say I want to create a diff pair here, and I don't even really have to select both of these. I can just basically go to differential pairs and say create different pairs from nets. Altium's going to bring up a dialog that you're probably familiar with if you've done this on the PCB side. All right, so under the PCB panel and the PCB layout area, you'll see something like this. And so Altium does recognize, because of the suffixes, that this is a differential pair. So if I press execute, this will now be listed up here as a differential pair. And again, you'll want to save your changes. Okay, you have your group B and your group C. By the way, if you notice this over here, this went from orange into green. So why is that? Because basically Altium took the information from the directives and filled it in. So what this is saying now is that your constraint is now in sync with the with what's going on there. Now, if I was to do something like this, where I go in, I say, now I really want 6 mils over here, okay, then it's now going to complain about the fact that this rule is not in sync. And by the way, even if this one is in sync, it's still going to flag the whole thing as not being in sync for this particular rule. So, and if I want to change it back, it should be a happy camper after that. Okay, there we go. So if I want to create, let's say, group D into a class, and I didn't put a directive out there, pretty much the same thing. You can right click here, and there's actually 3 ways to do it. You can save the classes as, if you highlighted them all, let's say you like, I know exactly what I want to have as a class, then you can say add selected to class, and then it will already have it pre-filled out, and you just have to give it a name. If you're just like, well, I just need to create a class, but I've got to go pick and choose through a big list, then you can do that this way. And if you kind of want to build multiple classes, like let's go to Class Explorer. This one kind of sort of looks like the one that you see on the PCB side. So you can create a bunch of different classes in this editor. This is also where you can make edits. So if you're not happy, for example, with the name of it, then you can do that as well. But just to quickly demonstrate it, let's say I want to add a class here. So I've got my new class. Let's call this one Group D, right? And then from there, I'm going to say, okay, just as you'd expect it to work, right? Because it should look pretty similar to what the classic dialogues look like. And I can press OK. And now I've got my group D. And by the way, this also propagates over to the electrical side as well. So whatever I've done over here, we can do that. I will mention very quickly about the X signals. Let me do this. I want to make sure I have enough time for questions. If people are curious about the X signals, I will demonstrate that, ask the question, and I will do it. There's a little bit of work behind it, and I want to make sure that I get through everything else without being a little rushed, right? But so that's how we'd set these up. Now, in terms of the rules, it's a matter of just going into it. So let's say, for instance, I want to set up a set of rules for group D. Let's just grab this rule here. I could set it up for each individual one. Everything here is available for each individual, and I can override something I do for a net class. But let's say I want to set this one up for group D. All right, so I'm going to go into here, and let's say I want to keep this one at 6, and I want a preferred width of 11. You'll see why I'm doing this here for a moment. Okay. Now, the reason I did this is because what you'll notice here, and this to me is what I'll call a rough edge that Altium has to work off a little bit, but you'll notice we have the min width and we have the preferred width. We don't have the max width, and what I've noticed is that Altium does not automatically take the preferred and make that at least the same as the max width. It recognizes that there's an error because these all turn red, but it does not necessarily automatically bring it up to the preferred width. So just be aware of that, because there'll be some consequences obviously further down the line if this propagates over to the PCB side. So let me just give that 1,000, just because I don't want to really restrict it. And you'll notice this now became white from the red here. Now there's another thing that's really important here, and Altium made this very clear in their demonstration back in December. On the schematic side, you can create rules for the top and the bottom layers, not for the middle layers. Now, a customer of ours who is using the Constraint Manager, asked me about that. And if you really think about it, the schematic side has never had anything to do with the layer stack up. That has always been a feature of the PCB side. So if people did want to set this up over here, Altium would probably have to invest a lot of time and energy into it, because again, it's just not something that Altium, the schematic side, recognizes. And from a conceptual point of view, it doesn't make sense because it's not supposed to really get into the physical elements of things. Obviously a board has a top and a bottom, so they can say, yeah, okay, but by its nature, it's going to have at least 2 sides, but it doesn't want to, Altium does not want to get in the business of trying to define middle layers on the schematic side. So just be aware of that. Okay. So we can continue to go through here and make different changes here. So here's our clearance rule. So if we want to make a specific clearance rule for this group, we can do that. And again, if we want to do comparisons between this one and another one, we can do that through the clearance matrix. There's also things for like via styles. So if I don't want to have this particular via, it's like, well, it's a little too big. I want to make this a little bit smaller. So let's say, I'm just throwing some numbers at this. Let's say we cut these in half, okay? So you'll see that these have changed up over here. You also have your polygon connect stuff. So if you want, for some reason, to have two connectors, rotation 45, I'm just trying to make these things a little bit different from what you have that's already set up here. So let me go here to advanced, there we go. And so I'm gonna just change these just to show that there's something different over here. And that's what you got. And there are situations where there are rules that Altium will not turn on by default. So here's a new rule that a relatively new rule. So it's called the same net clearance. If you want to add it, you can do so. So this one would be something for like inductors or even accordions, where you have a concern about, a net that might be in an accordion type of shape, or something that might be coming close to itself because of it turning into itself. So that's what you can do over here, is you can set this up in terms of a length. Now, here's another thing you'll notice too, is that if there is some type of range, then it'll show that range over here. So if I went over here and I said, no, I really actually want everything to always be 7 mils, then this will just become 7 mils, okay? So now that I've set this up, just to give you an idea, let's say I'm pretty happy with this and I want this. And by the way, you'll notice that as I've been doing this, Group D has been following suit, right? So everything that's been happening that I've been putting in this one, everything that's in the Group D has been getting the same numbers. Now let's say I want to make this available to everything, right? So what I can do here is I can right click where it says constraint set, and I can create a constraint set. So let's go over here and say, all right, let's save as a constraint set. And let's call this one Group D. And I'm gonna call it physical, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay, it's really for demonstration purposes, but I'm gonna call this Group D physical. And you'll notice that there'll be these little brackets at the top left corners of each one of these. So it just indicates that this is a part of this constraint set. So let's say I want to apply the same thing to Group C. I can do that. I can right click here and say, hey, I want to select a constraint set. I'm going to use the Group D physical one. And voila, there it is. Now, and everything follows suit below it. Now, let's say I'm being rebellious and saying, well, you know what, this particular net over here needs to be 7 mils. I can still do that, okay? And so it's not like this is hard step. Now, if I go into here and say, well, I want all these to be 7, and say, okay, what will happen here is you'll notice that down below, it'll say constraint set Group D physical. Do I want to change that? And I can say yes. And so here I can say I want all these to be 7, not 6. All right, and then from there I can say save, and then all these will now propagate through. So anything that was under that constraint set will propagate through there. Now, what about the electrical side? So electrical side has its set of rules, but the one thing that happens here is that the constraint set I just create doesn't propagate to this side. So if I right click, you'll see that if I say select constraint set, it doesn't select it. So whatever constraint set you set up on the physical side is going to be for the physical side. Whatever's on the electrical side is going to be on the electrical side. And the same concept applies to this, right? We can go through each one of these where we can set up a particular Group B for electrical, and then we create the constraint, we can apply it to the other ones as well, right? So that, I'm not going to go through the same motions of it, but it works the exact same way. And then lastly here, let's just talk about the clearances. The clearances, you can see that with some of these groups, because I created them within the environment. So if you pull them in from the directives, then they don't show up over here, but if they were created within the constraint environment, they do show up. But that's not to say I can't add Group B in here. So we never created a Group A, by the way. And so I can add those in here. So if I do want to have additional rules that say like, look, if I've got Group C to Group B, I've got to keep these things further apart from each other. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say 10 to these, okay? Or pardon me, 20 to these, just to have something a little bit different. What's interesting about this is that, and think about this from a rule perspective, we can have multiple clearance rules for nets, right? And so even though this B and C are like this over here, if we go to the physical side, these don't automatically propagate over. So none of these took on the clearances over here. What Altium's going to do is it will create a rule on the physical side specific to this net or these net classes. It's going to create these matrix, another set of rules for these for these matrices here, these clearance matrices, and then it's just a matter of you setting the priority for those, okay? Now, as I mentioned earlier on, if you push this over to the PCB side, in order to get this over to the PCB side, you got to do an ECO, okay? But there's two more things that just dawned on me before we do that. Number one, let me go back to the physical side. If you want to see where this net is, there's a feature they recently added in, and you could do a cross probe. So let's say I want to know where this is. You click on cross probe, and it will bring you right there, okay? Let me do a save on this since I'm up here. And then lastly, and this is a feature I really like, which I wish they did in the design rules. Let's say you're not a big fan of Imperial, you want to work in pardon me, if you're not a big fan of Imperial, you want to go to metric, then if you do a control Q, these will simultaneously switch over to all of your metric based stuff. So I like the fact that you can do that in real time in this particular editor, constraints editor. So let's save this here. All right, so let's push this over to the, let's go over here into our design, and we're gonna update the PCB document, okay? So I'll push this over, and let's take a look at what we got over here in the engineering change order. So obviously we're pushing parts, and we're gonna be pushing the net list over here. The component class, this is not something that was created by the Constraint Manager. This is a byproduct of the project options, okay? So this is, there's again, in 24's version, there's nothing for component classes in the Constraint Manager at this time. You'll see that our 3 net classes were created, our differential pairs are there, and our rules are in there as well. And so be careful, because you might look at this rule and say, if you don't extend it out by putting your cursor on top of it, you can say, well, why is it changing this rule? That's the exact same rule I've got on the PCB side. You really have to look and see what's being changed. So again, it's bundling it up in kind of a package, saying like, okay, well, yeah, there's one of those things that got changed. So it's showing all the things that are going to be pushed over, even if most of it is a duplication, okay? So that's what you're seeing over here being pushed. I'm going to execute the changes. Okay, and so everything looks good. Just want to make sure we have no errors there. Everything looks good there. And yes, we have our parts over here, but really for this demonstration, let's go into Design, Constraint Manager. Let's take a look at that here. And so you can see everything did come in. Okay, so if I try to split, I'm going to split this here. So let's do a split vertical so you can see the difference between the two. So here is the schematic side, and here is the PCB side, the layout side. Now, these are all kind of scrunched up, but if we expand those out, this should look the exact same. So the numberings should all be the same. Let's see, did we get everything expanded out? I think we did. The only difference is that the X nets are not in here because I didn't push any over at this time. Okay, so the differential pairs, and there you go. So these numbers should match verbatim. Now, by the way, I did come across another rough edge, just for your FYI. If you already had the Constraint Manager open in Altium and you do an ECO, it sometimes doesn't pick up. The Constraint Manager on the PCB side does not pick up. At that point, close it and bring it back up again, and it will pick up on those changes. So just be aware of that. But everything else that we've got over here has pulled over, okay? And so your electrical and so on and so forth. And obviously we didn't do much on the electrical side. And then of course you have your all rules too. So now if I go into like width, you can see that I've got these all set up. And if I need to make changes now, which is where those changes are going to happen, they can be done on the PCB side. One last thing is that if you need to push this back to the schematic side, oddly enough, even though you're in the Constraint Manager, you don't have the menu capability of doing an ECO in here. So if you do need to push it over, you need to go back over to your PCB dock, and then you can go into Design, Update, and push it over from there. Okay, so you can push things over back and forth to try to keep them in sync. All right, so now that I've kind of given you guys an overview of this, let's get back into my slide deck here, if I can find it here, and continue from the current slide. I'd like to throw a polling question at you. Are you planning on using it on your next project? Here. So interesting. So I kind of figured a good portion of you would say possibly in the future, but not soon. And I get that, right? Because look, we've all grown up on the design rules. So I kind of expected there would be a high percentage of people saying, yeah, it's cool, but not yet. And then where we say, absolutely, I think for those 20%, I'm glad you're doing that because that's what's going to improve the tool. And for those who say need some maturing, that's kind of where I would be with it at this point. I think that it probably needs a few more touches and things, but yeah, I got you. And of course, those who are the 10%ers, I totally get where you're coming from. And then lastly, we do have the polling question, just what do you think of our webinar today? Okay, so you can see our numbers over here, and yeah, I wish we could give out the cookies. I think that'd be a great incentive. I remember going to, in college years ago, like half the battle of getting people to go to any type of lecture outside of class was to have them come and get pizza or donuts or cookies. So I get it. But yeah, thank you for your feedback on that. We really appreciate it. If you don't mind, I would like to just talk a moment about 9.connects, and I'll get on to some questions that you may have. You want to learn more about this feature, right? The Constraint Manager is this new creature that Altium's put in there. It's good to know what it can do so you can make an intelligent decision as to whether or not you want to use it. Determine its viability in your projects, and to try to keep up with the latest and greatest with Altium Designer, which is really hard because they're always adding in major features into the tool. These aren't like little, oh, yeah, we improved this little dialogue, or we enhanced this little feature within this main, this editor over here. They're creating actual editors. And so there's a lot being thrown at us, which is great. So I'm glad that they're constantly evolving, as they put it, this right over here. And we recognize that. And it's easy to get stuck in your comfort zone, especially using tools. You're in the middle of a project, right? Just trying to get the project done. The last thing you want to do is go splunking through the tool. You may have heard of something that might work, but a lot of times, like, I know it can work, but I know that if I do it this way, it will work. So we understand that. That's always kind of the catch-22 when you're dealing with projects. And the information's out there when you're looking for it, but it is fragmented and all over the place. Even when I did this Constraint Manager one, I was trying to see what was already out there, and there are bits and pieces out there, but I have yet to see anybody really do what we just did here today. So let me talk a little bit what we do here at 9.connects. We do really three things: PCB design. Say I would like the ugly stuff. I don't want to dwell on this too much here today, but look, if you got something that's overwhelming you, or you see a project that you might find rather challenging, just talk to us. More than happy to just let you know what we think about it, the viability of it, and eventually you may say, well, thanks for the help, and be on your merry way, and that's fine. If you're successful, then we're ultimately successful as well. We do training, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in a moment, but we do 3 classes. We do a PCB Foundations class, which is just an introduction to the whole process of printed circuit boards. Altium Designer Full Spectrum Training. This is our 4-day class in which we really take you through through Altium, and I'll talk more about this one here in just a moment. And we also have our A365 training in which we get someone who wants to get A365 up and running for their company. We can provide that for them. And then for libraries, we've beaten this bush, but hey, anything libraries, come talk to us and see what we can do for you. But let me talk about the full spectrum training. It is taught on the latest version of Altium, so it's not like, maybe we ought to get around to updating it. That's not the case. Eric, who teaches this, he's on top of this. If there's a new version, he wants to make sure that he's able to teach it, or at least show something about it, depending on the length or the size or the breadth of it. But he does do that. All these classes are taught by Eric. He's a degreed engineer. He's also a layout designer. So the cool part about this is that, yes, you can go to Altium. I'm not saying that they don't know their tool, but they're tool pushers, right? They know how to press buttons. They know how the features work. But Eric knows how they work in context to the design. And so when we teach the full spectrum training, teach basically Altium Designer, we're teaching it from a project perspective, not necessarily a tool perspective. So that's what we do with that. There's hands-on lecture, there's lecture and there's hands-on exercises. Of course, we do want people to participate in the lecture, but there's exercises that go along with that here. So that concludes kind of our main part of the webinar.